A sacrament is an experience of Jesus, an encounter with Jesus.
So to me, a sacrament is this outward thing. It's like stuff that contains this promise of God.
A sacrament is God's promises with visual aids. It's a way that God says, I promise that I'm going to encounter you here. As if you're walking down the street and God says, I promise I'm going to be right there on that corner. And a sacrament is God saying, I'm going to show up.
Because sometimes it's hard to just hear words. We need to have an experience where we can sense with multiple senses the goodness and forgiveness of God.
Well, one of the beautiful things about Lutheran theology is that it's an embodied theology. So what that means is that we don't just have ideas that we talk about. We have stuff. We have water, we have bread, we have wine. And so the sacrament of the Eucharist is this gracious gift of God's own self in the form of bread and wine that we take in to ourselves, and then we go out into the world with God, with Christ in us. We then get to go and be Christ in the world.
It all comes from Christ. And we realize in communion that we have nothing to offer to God but to come to Him honestly and openly and receive what God has to give to us through the cross.
The water in baptism washes over us. So God's promises are actually washing over us in this physical way. That the promise of God's presence is so there in the bread and the wine in a kind of mysterious, beautiful way. But it's stuff. It's not just ideas.
I remember one specific moment where I shared communion with a smaller group of people. And I went forward to receive the bread and the body. And I went forward to receive the blood and the wine. And it wasn't like the little pieces of bread that you get and the little cups of wine, or we didn't dip. I got a huge chunk of bread and a overflowing cup of wine. And it was amazing because I didn't expect that, but when I went back to reflect on it, I realized that Christ didn't die to just give us a piece of grace, a piece of forgiveness, a little bit of salvation, but He died to give everything to us, everything that we need in this life and in the next.
God tells us that He provides everything that we need for daily living, and when we receive communion, part of what we're understanding is that God gives us that promise. And so not only are we receiving the bread right there in communion, but God is promising us that He's going to take care of our daily bread, our food and our clothes and our shelter and the things that we need. Those are one of His desires. That's one of His desires for us, is that we have what we need.
There's this great story from my colleague here at church. This little boy wasn't trained for communion yet. The communion bread came around and he reached out literally as a 2-year-old and grabbed the bread and pulled it in. I can think of no more better way to make an oath towards the mysteries of God than actually grabbing it, trying to stuff it into your face.
Communion brings us together as the body of Christ, and we become all the same. When we approach the body and blood of Christ, the bread and the wine, we realize our need for that. No matter what's going on in our lives, we realize at communion that our greatest need is what Christ has offered us on the cross.
Well, God promises to provide for all our needs, and we need forgiveness, and so He offers that specifically in communion. But we also need food and shelter and family and friends, and God promises to provide those things too. And when we trust Him, life is full and complete. When we trust that He'll provide those things.
The most precious word that I love in giving Holy Communion, it's not saying the body of Christ, although I love that too, but it's saying those final words, the body of Christ for you. Luther loved those two words, for you. All of God's wonder, all of God's creation, all of God's love, all of God's forgiveness, all of that could happen out there in the world, but it wouldn't mean anything at all if you didn't know that all of that love, all that power was all given for